The man who almost killed my husband walked free because of money. The town made sure freedom was the worst thing he ever got. My husband Ori is a mechanic. He runs a small shop on the main road and he's been fixing cars there for 11 years. He's 5'7" and wiry and he's never been in a fight in his life. He stays open late when someone breaks down on a Friday night. He fixes single mothers' brakes and tells them to pay when they can. He taught 3 kids from the high school how to do oil changes through a vocational program he volunteered for. On a Saturday night in October, Ori closed up at 8 and walked to his truck in the back lot. A man named Kessler Dean was parked there, cutting through to skip the traffic light. Our dumpster was blocking his path because the waste company hadn't pushed it back after pickup. Ori walked over and told Kessler he'd move it. Kessler got out of his car and told Ori he should keep his property in order. Ori apologized and said he'd take care of it right now. Kessler shoved him. Ori stumbled back and put his hands up and told him he didn't want any trouble. Kessler hit him, not once. He beat my husband so badly that when the paramedics arrived, Ori was unconscious on the asphalt with a fractured eye socket, a broken jaw, 4 broken ribs, and bleeding inside his skull. He was airlifted 40 minutes away because our local hospital couldn't handle the brain swelling. I got the call while I was putting our daughter to bed. I drove 90 and sat in a waiting room for 6 hours while surgeons operated on my husband's head. They told me twice he might not make it. He made it. 3 weeks in the hospital, 4 months recovering at home. He couldn't walk without help for the first 6 weeks. He couldn't chew solid food for 2 months. Our daughter was 4 and she asked me every morning why daddy was sleeping so much. I told her daddy was resting. I didn't know how to explain to a 4-year-old that her father had nearly been killed in a parking lot over a dumpster. Kessler Dean was the son of Vernon Dean, who owned the largest dealership in the county, along with a hotel, 2 restaurants, and most of the commercial real estate. 3 generations of Dean money. Their name was on the youth sports complex and the library annex. Kessler had a lawyer at the station before the officer finished the paperwork. The trial took 5 months. His defense argued Ori initiated the confrontation, and Kessler acted in self-defense, feeling threatened. They painted my 5'7" husband, who apologized before he was hit, as the aggressor. The jury came back not guilty. Kessler walked out of the courthouse holding his mother's arm, and his father shook the lawyer's hand on the steps. I was sitting in the second row holding a folder of medical bills totaling over $280,000. Ori was at home because he still couldn't sit in a hard chair more than an hour without pain. The town knew the verdict before I got home. Within an hour, every person in our community knew that Kessler Dean beat a man half to death over a dumpster and walked away clean. Nobody organized anything. Nobody made a plan. It just started happening. The dealership emptied. Within 2 weeks, the showroom was bare on a Saturday, which hadn't happened in 30 years. People who'd bought cars from the Deans for decades started driving to the next county. The steakhouse lost its Friday crowd. The breakfast place that used to have a 40-minute wait on Sundays. You could walk in and sit immediately. The hotel stopped getting booked. The Rotary Club moved their annual dinner 2 towns over. The high school boosters switched their banquet to the fire station. When Vernon called the booster president, he was told the fire station had better parking. Everyone knew that wasn't the reason. I knew it wouldn't last on its own. People forget. So I started bringing Ori to the shop every day, even when he could barely stand, and I sat with him at the front counter where every customer could see the scars on his face. Vernon Dean started his counter campaign 3 weeks in. He didn't send lawyers. He went door to door. He sat with the hardware store owner and talked about the Little League dugouts the Dean family had paid for 2 summers ago. He sat at the diner and reminded the woman who runs it that his family had catered her daughter's wedding at cost. He wasn't threatening anyone. He was making people feel like they owed him, and in a small town, debts like that feel real. Then I drove past the hardware store and stopped cold. A Dean automotive calendar was hanging in the front window. It hadn't been there the week before. 2 businesses that had quietly stopped sending customers had started again. Not loudly, but they were doing it. Bertie, who runs the flower shop next to ours, came by on a Wednesday with that look on her face. She sat across from me and said Vernon had come by her shop the day before, hadn't bought anything, just talked about how much his family had done for this town. Then he'd looked at her front window and said, "That's a nice spot for a sign." He didn't say what kind. He didn't have to. I needed to remind people why they were angry, not with words. Words are easy to argue with. I needed something that couldn't be argued with. I called Dex first. Dex was a retired business consultant who'd been a friend of my father's for 20 years. I told him what was happening with Vernon's door-to-door tour. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said 5 words that changed how I thought about all of it. Make them come to you. He explained it. Stop chasing them. Stop reacting. Just be visible and let them panic. Then I drove to the print shop where Casey, an old friend of Ori's, worked. I showed him the photos from the hospital, the ones I'd taken in those first days when I didn't even know why I was taking them. Ori's face swollen so bad you couldn't see his left eye. Surgical staples running along his scalp like a railroad track. Casey looked at them, and his whole face changed. He set my phone down carefully like it was made of glass. He asked if I was sure. I told him my husband almost died, and I wanted people to remember what almost dying looks like. Casey printed me several copies, clean and sharp, and didn't charge me a penny. I didn't post them anywhere public. I bought a simple black frame at the craft store and put the worst photo in it, the one where Ori's face was so swollen you couldn't tell it was him. I brought that framed photo to the shop the next morning and set it on the front counter, right next to the register, where every customer would see it before they said hello. No sign, no caption. The first customer that day was a guy in for an oil change. His eyes went to the frame and he just stopped. He stared for 10 seconds, then looked at Ori standing there with the scar above his eye and the slightly crooked jaw, and I watched him put it together, the photo and the person. When he left, he shook Ori's hand with both of his and held on a beat longer than normal. That's how it went all week. Person after person walking in, seeing the photo, going quiet, then looking at my husband with something in their eyes that Vernon's guilt trips couldn't touch. Because Vernon could talk all day about dugouts. He could remind every business owner about every favor, but he couldn't stand next to that photo. He couldn't put his arm around the image of my husband's broken face and explain it away. By the end of the week, the hardware store owner took the Dean calendar out of his window. I never said a word to him. He never said a word to me. He just took it down. A few days later, my best friend Nayeli called me at night. She said the head chef at the Dean Steakhouse had quit that afternoon. Just walked out, no notice. His wife told Nayeli he'd been been sick over it for months. Physically sick. He told her he couldn't work for people who acted like their kid didn't almost kill somebody. Nayeli said Vernon had called a staff meeting after the trial and told everyone the subject was closed. No one was allowed to mention Kessler or the case or Ori. Like it didn't happen. Like Ori didn't happen. I didn't say anything for a long time. I just sat there thinking about a man I'd never met who cooked steaks and went home at night feeling so wrong about where he worked that it made him sick. About a week later, Ori got a card in the mail from the high school. He opened it at the table while I was making dinner. I heard him go quiet behind me. Not the kind of quiet where someone's reading. The kind where someone stops breathing for a second. It was an oversized card covered in signatures. We miss you, Mr. Birch. The shop isn't the same without you. 14 students and 3 teachers from the vocational program. One drew a wrench. Another wrote, you taught me how to change a tire and my mom says that's the most useful thing I learned all year. Ori put the card down, put his hands over his face, and started crying. Not loud, just this broken sound from somewhere deep. It was the first time I'd seen him cry since the hospital. Ariella patted in her socks holding a crayon. She looked at him with that serious face little kids make when they're trying to figure out something that doesn't make sense yet. Then she climbed right into his lap, put her small hand on his cheek and said, it's okay, Daddy, you can rest more. I had to leave the room. I went down the hall to the bathroom and pressed my back against the door and stood there trying to breathe, because that was the whole thing right there. A good man broken by someone who gave nothing, being comforted by a 4-year-old who knew enough to climb into his lap and tell him it was okay, and somewhere across town, Kessler Dean was living his life. I started planning a fundraiser the next morning. I didn't call it a fundraiser for Ori. I didn't put his name on it. I called it Neighbors Helping Neighbors and booked the fire station for a Saturday afternoon. Local businesses would donate goods and services, people would come and buy them, and the money would go to families in the community who needed help. It wasn't about us, at least that's what it said on the flyer, but everybody knew. Every business I reached out to said yes. The bakery donated $300 in pastries. The tire shop offered free rotations. The woman who does hair donated 10 free cuts. Every business in town, except the Dean-owned ones. Nobody asked them. Nobody told them they couldn't participate. They just weren't part of it. And that absence said more than any flyer ever could. The event sold out in 2 days. People called asking if they could just donate without coming. The phone didn't stop ringing for 48 hours. The fundraiser raised enough to cover 2 months of Ori's physical therapy. He came in a wheelchair because standing still wore him out, and I watched person after person line up just to shake his hand. On the drive home, he turned to me and said, maybe we're going to be okay. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Ori. His voice was flat and too controlled. Kessler Dean was just here. My hands went still. Ori said, he walked in like a customer. He looked at the counter. He saw the photo. He looked at the photo for a long time. Then he looked at me and said, you need to tell people the truth. Tell them it was a fair fight. Tell them I'm not what they think I am. You owe me that. I asked what he said back. I told him to get out of my shop. He didn't move. He said, your wife is turning this whole town against my family. I told him to get out again. He left, but he stopped at the door and said, this isn't over. I leaned against the counter and stood there a long time after we hung up. I wasn't scared. What I felt was fury. Pure, clean, white, hot fury that started in my chest and spread out to my fingers. Kessler Dean walked into my husband's shop, looked at the man whose skull he fractured, whose eye socket he shattered, whose jaw he broke in 2 places, and told him to lie for him. I wanted to scream, but I sat down on the floor with Ariella and watched her color for 10 minutes until my hands stopped shaking. 2 days later, my phone rang. Henrietta Dean, Kessler's mother. I think you and I should talk. Woman to woman, mother to mother. My son made a mistake. Your husband got hurt, but destroying our family's livelihood won't unbreak those bones, will it? A mistake. She called it a mistake. I said, your son beat my husband unconscious over a dumpster. He fractured his skull. Our daughter spent months asking me why Daddy was sleeping so much. And 3 days ago, your son walked into Ori's shop and told him to lie for him. That's not a mistake. That's a pattern. The line went quiet. When she spoke again, the sweetness was thinner. You're teaching this town to be cruel. Vernon employs people. Real people with families. Is that what you want? For working people to suffer because you can't let go? I gripped the counter and said, I didn't ask a single person to stop going to your husband's dealership. They did that on their own. Maybe instead of calling me, you should ask yourself why an entire town came to that conclusion without anybody telling them to. That's not my doing. That's yours. The line went dead. The next afternoon, someone knocked on the front door. 3 solid raps. I opened it, and Vernon Dean was standing on my porch in a full suit, his hair combed back, his shoes polished. My first thought wasn't about the boycott. It was that my daughter was sleeping 20 feet away on the other side of that wall. He came to my house. He said, I'm here to offer a settlement, a private one. No lawyers. I'll cover every medical bill, every lost wage, and add a significant amount on top. All I need is for you to make a public statement that the matter is resolved. He said it like he was reading from a contract. I said, you came to my house, where my daughter naps, to buy my silence. His face didn't move. I'm trying to make this right. I said, you had a chance to make it right. It was called a trial. Your son's lawyer stood in front of a jury and called my husband the aggressor. Your family sat in that courtroom every day and watched them lie. And when it was over, you stood on the courthouse steps and shook that lawyer's hand. You smiled. I saw you. I took a breath. You're not here because you feel bad. You're here because your dealership is empty and your restaurants are losing money. This is about your bottom line, Vernon. The answer is no. He stood there a moment. Then he turned and walked down my porch steps to his car. But I saw something. His hands. They were shaking. Not a lot. The kind you might not notice if you weren't looking. But I was looking. And I understood something I hadn't fully understood before. Vernon Dean, the man whose name was on buildings and ball fields, was standing on my porch with shaking hands because he couldn't fix this. He couldn't write a check big enough. His son broke something that money couldn't put back together. And for maybe the first time in his life, Vernon Dean was standing in front of a problem his wallet couldn't solve. That night I called Dex and told him everything. He listened the way he always did. Then he asked if I had a stage coming up. I told him the community spring market was in 3 weeks. He was quiet a moment and then he said, that's your moment. Something better than footage. Something they can't argue with. The spring market came on the first warm Saturday in April. The town square was packed by 9 in the morning. Every local business had a booth. We weren't selling anything. We had a sign that said free vehicle safety safety checks, and a stack of flyers for the vocational program. Ori was there, standing on his own, which still made my chest tight every time I saw it. Slow, wincing when he turned too fast. The scar above his eye still pink and curved up toward his hairline, but he was there, shaking hands, asking about people's cars and families and remembering details. He didn't mention Kessler once. He was just Ori, doing what Ori does. What people did notice was who wasn't there. The deans had no booth, no banner. For as long as anyone could remember, the dean name had been on something at every major town event, but not today. Nothing. Someone behind me said, "Huh, no dean sponsorship this year," and someone else said, "Good, just good." One word that carried the weight of everything this town had decided. Birdie found me near the lemonade stand. She leaned in and said Vernon had tried to buy a sponsorship spot last week. The market board turned him down. They said all the spots were taken. They weren't. They just didn't want his name on anything. Midway through the morning, I walked up to the small wooden stage at the far end of the square and turned on the microphone. People near the front looked over, then more, then more. I didn't start with what happened to Ori. I didn't mention the trial. I didn't mention the verdict. I didn't say a single dean name. I talked about my husband. I told them about the 11 years he'd spent in that shop, about the Friday nights he stayed open late for strangers, about the single mothers whose brakes he fixed and told them to pay when they could. I pulled out the card from the vocational students and read it out loud. I held it up so people could see the signatures and the wrench one of them had drawn in the corner. I told them about the 3 kids he'd taught to do oil changes because he believed every kid should know how to take care of a car, about the family whose van broke down in a snowstorm on Christmas Eve, how he stayed until midnight fixing their heater and refused to take a penny because they had kids in the back seat and it was Christmas Eve. I didn't plan to cry, and I didn't. I just listed, one by one, the ways my husband had poured himself into this town for over a decade. By the time I looked up from the microphone, the square had gone quiet. Food stand lines had stopped moving. There were maybe 200 people standing in front of that stage. Some had tears running down their cheeks. Some were just standing very still with their jaws tight. One older man near the back had his hat off, holding it against his chest. I didn't say the dean name. I didn't need to. Every person in that square knew what I was saying without me saying it. They knew who hurt this man, and they knew what they were looking at, which was a wife telling the truth about a husband who deserved better. Ori came up beside me. He stood there, this 5'7" guy with a scar above his eye and hands that smelled like engine oil, and he let them see him. Then he leaned into the microphone and said, "I just want to fix cars and raise my daughter and be a good neighbor. That's all I ever wanted." The applause started before he finished. It was long, and it didn't stop. People clapped and kept clapping, and some of them were crying while they clapped, and the applause went on for over a minute. After we came down, a man I'd never seen walked up to Ori's table, tall, work jacket, the kind of hands that said he did something physical. He introduced himself and said he was from the next county over, and that he managed a fleet of service vehicles. 12 trucks. He'd been looking for an honest mechanic. He'd like to give Ori the contract. Ori blinked. He looked at me. I nodded. He shook the man's hand. It was the biggest contract his shop had ever been offered. And right then, while Ori was shaking that man's hand, I felt something pull at the edge of my attention. I looked up, past the food stands, past the parked trucks, and I saw him, Kessler Dean, standing about 30 feet away, half hidden behind a parked truck, alone. No parents, no lawyer, no suit, just standing there, watching Ori shake hands with a stranger who wanted to give him business, watching the crowd that had just stood in a town square and clapped for a full minute for the man Kessler had nearly killed. Our eyes met. I held it. I didn't look away. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel scared. I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt nothing. He was just a man standing behind a truck with nothing to say and no one to say it to. After a few seconds, he turned around and walked back to his car and drove away. That evening, Nayeli called me. Vernon put the steakhouse up for sale this afternoon, hours after the market. The breakfast place near the square closed its doors the following week. Just gone. A sign that said, "Closed until further notice." But everyone knew there wasn't going to be any further notice. The dealership, which had already lost over 60% of its traffic, started running desperate promotions. Big signs, banners, prices so low they didn't make sense. Nobody went. The lot stayed empty. The salesmen stood around in their short sleeves with nothing to do. Kessler Dean was not in prison. He was not in exile. He was something worse than all of that. He was irrelevant. He lived in the same town, walked the same streets, drove the same roads. But the town had decided, without a single meeting, without a petition, without a protest, that he and his family and their name meant nothing anymore. Not because someone told them to, because they chose to. I tucked Ariella into bed that night. She said, "Daddy was happy today." I smoothed her hair back and said, "Yeah, baby, he was." Ori came out to the porch a few minutes later. He didn't say anything. He just sat down next to me and reached over and took my hand. His grip was warm and steady. The shop was booked out for 3 months. The fleet contract was signed. The vocational program had already called asking when he could come back. The dean name was coming off the youth sports complex in the fall because the town council voted to rename it after a retired teacher who'd coached there for 30 years. And somewhere across town, in a big house paid for with money that used to mean something in this place, Kessler Dean was sitting with everything money could buy and nothing it couldn't. No handshake from a stranger who trusted him. No card from students who missed him. No daughter climbing into his lap. No town clapping for a full minute because they believed in who he was. Just a name that used to open every door in the county and now couldn't open a single one that mattered.